beyond the noise of the mind, beyond words, beyond concepts. What is God? The mind will try to grasp this question, to define it, to reduce it to something it can hold on to. It may say, God is this, or God is that. But any definition is already a limitation. It turns the infinite into something small, something bound by thought. The truth is, God is not something to be believed in. God is not an idea. God is the stillness behind all things, the space in which everything arises and dissolves. God is not separate from you. It is not something out there to be found. It is the essence of your very being, the presence that is always here, before thought, before identity, before time itself. When you look at a flower, without the voice in your head naming it, categorizing it, just seeing, just being, there is God. When you feel the silent depth of your own presence, free from past and future, there is God. Many have tried to describe God. Some call it consciousness, some call it life itself, others call it love. But these are just words. The truth is found not in the words, but in the space between them. When you are still, when you surrender to this moment completely, something opens up, a vastness, an aliveness. You sense a presence that has no form, yet it is more real than anything in the world. That is God. The mind is conditioned to seek definitions, to place reality into boxes of understanding. It wants certainty, clarity, something solid to grasp. This is why, throughout history, humanity has created endless descriptions of God. The human mind, fearful of the unknown, has tried to reduce the infinite into something that can be explained. And yet every concept, every name, every attempt to define what cannot be defined ultimately falls short. God is not an idea, not a thought, not something that can be captured in language. When we use the word God, we immediately create an image in the mind. That image will always be limited. Some may see a figure in the sky, others may see an energy, a force, a creator. But whatever the mind imagines, it is not the truth. It is only a thought form. Even the most profound spiritual insights, when turned into concepts, become static. They no longer carry the living truth, but instead become part of the mental landscape, a belief rather than a direct experience. To truly know God, one must go beyond all conceptual understanding. One must step into the unknown, into the space where thought does not interfere. God is not something to be understood with the mind, but something that can only be realized in the depths of stillness. It is the silent presence that underlies all of existence, the space in which all things arise and dissolve. It is not separate from life, not something outside of yourself, not an entity in some distant realm. It is here, now, always. Everything that exists appears and disappears within this vast presence. The trees, the mountains, the rivers, the people, everything is an expression of it. But these forms are not God itself. They are temporary manifestations within the greater formlessness. Just as waves arise and fall back into the ocean, all things in existence are movements within the eternal presence. The ocean remains, but the waves come and go. To mistake the waves for the ocean itself is to misunderstand their true nature. The mind is uncomfortable with formlessness. It wants to grasp, to categorize, to turn everything into an object. And yet God is not an object. It is not something that can be observed from a distance. The moment you try to define it, it slips away, because in defining you create separation. You become the observer and place God as something external, something other. But God is not other. It is the very ground of your being, the space in which your own awareness arises. If you sit quietly, without seeking, without trying to grasp anything, a subtle yet profound realization begins to arise. You sense that behind all thoughts, behind all emotions, behind every experience, there is something that does not change. It is not a thing, not an entity, but a presence, a knowing, a stillness that has always been there. This is what people have called God, not a being with attributes, not something to be worshipped from a distance, but the essence of existence itself. Every sound appears and disappears within silence, yet silence is never affected. Every movement occurs within space, yet space itself remains untouched. Likewise, everything in life, every thought, every feeling, every experience arises within the formless presence that is always here. That presence is what we call God, not as a belief, not as a doctrine, but as the living reality that underlies all things. It is the very fabric of existence, the eternal stillness from which everything emerges. The challenge is that human beings are deeply identified with the mind. The mind thrives on form, on definitions, on creating a sense of self based on thought. But the moment you look beyond thought, the moment you turn your attention to the pure awareness that is always present, something shifts. You no longer seek God as something separate. You no longer try to understand it with the intellect. Instead, you begin to recognize it in the silent space between thoughts, in the still presence behind every experience. This is why the greatest spiritual teachers have always pointed not to believe, but to direct experience. Words can only point. They can never capture the truth itself. If someone tells you about the vastness of the ocean, but you have never seen water, their words remain just words. But if you step into the ocean, even without understanding its depth, its currents, or its mysteries, you will know it directly. In the same way, God is not something to be believed in. It is something to be known through direct experience. That experience does not come through effort, through seeking, through trying to achieve something. It comes in the absence of effort, in the surrender to this moment as it is. When the mind becomes still, when the need to define falls away, there is a quiet recognition of what has always been here. That recognition is not intellectual, it is a deep knowing beyond words. For many, the idea of formlessness is unsettling. The ego, which identifies with form, with identity, with labels, resists the idea of something that cannot be grasped. It wants security, something tangible, something that can be claimed. And yet God is not something to be possessed or owned. It cannot be turned into a belief system or confined within any tradition. It has been spoken of in many ways by many cultures, through many languages, yet it remains beyond all of them. The moment you say, this is God, you have already lost sight of it. The mind tries to define, but the truth is beyond all definitions. It is not something that can be put into words, because words belong to the realm of form. And yet the formless is the very source from which all form arises. It is the unseen foundation of everything that exists. When you truly begin to see this, you no longer see God as something outside yourself. You no longer look for it in the future, in some distant place, in some idea of heaven or beyond. You begin to realize that what you have been searching for has never been absent. It is not something you need to attain. It is already here, in this moment, in the very awareness that is reading these words. That awareness itself, the silent presence behind all thought, is the very thing the mind has been seeking. It is untouched by time, untouched by beliefs, untouched by anything that comes and goes. It is not a personal God, not something that belongs to one group, one faith, one tradition. It is the same presence that exists in all beings, in all things, beyond all distinction. To recognize this is to step beyond the limitations of the mind. It is to stop searching for an external God and to awaken to the formless essence that has always been within. Not as a thought, not as an idea, but as a living reality, a presence that has never been absent, waiting to be known beyond the limitations of the thinking mind. The greatest illusion that human beings live with is the sense of separation. From the moment we are born, we are given a name, an identity, a story that tells us who we are. This identity becomes the lens through which we perceive the world. We see ourselves as individuals, separate from everything else, separate from life, separate from nature, and ultimately separate from God. But this separation is not real. It is a mental construct, a belief that has been passed down through generations. In reality, there is no separation. God is not something external, something distant, something to be reached or attained. God is the very essence of your being, the life force that animates all things. The silent presence within you that has always been there. The mind creates a sense of self that is based on form. It identifies with the body, with thoughts, with emotions, with roles and titles. It says, I am this person, I have this name, I have this past, I have these beliefs. And yet all of these things are temporary. The body changes, thoughts come and go, emotions rise and fall, and roles shift over time. If all of these things are impermanent, then how can they be who you truly are? What remains when all of these things are stripped away? What is left when you are not defined by the past, not bound by thought, not limited by identity? What remains is the pure awareness that is always present. That awareness is not personal, not individual. It is the same awareness that exists in all beings. It is the essence of life itself. It is what people have called God. When you look at a tree, a bird, a mountain, you may think of them as separate objects, but they are not separate from the space in which they exist. A wave in the ocean may appear as an individual form, but it is never separate from the ocean itself. In the same way, you are not separate from the vast presence in which all things arise. The wave does not need to find the ocean. It is already the ocean in a temporary form. The same is true for you. You do not need to seek God as if it were something outside of you. You are already an expression of the divine, already an aspect of the infinite presence that pervades all things. Many spiritual traditions speak of God as something to be worshipped, something to be reached through effort, devotion, or discipline. The very idea that God is something outside of you creates a sense of distance, a belief that you must do something to bridge the gap. But this gap is an illusion. The idea of a distant God, a God that exists somewhere far away, is a projection of the human mind. It arises from the ego's tendency to see everything in terms of subject and object, self and other, here and there. But when you truly look, when you become still, when you stop seeking and simply rest in presence, you begin to see that there is no distance, there is no separation. Thought creates the illusion of separation. It creates the sense of I and you, this and that, self and other. But before thought arises, before words divide the world into concepts, there is only pure being. This pure being is the essence of all existence. It is what gives life to all things, what allows everything to exist in the first place. It is not something you can see as an object, because it is the very space in which seeing occurs. It is not something you can define, because it is beyond all definitions. It is not something you can grasp with the mind, because it is the source of the mind itself. If you sit in silence and simply observe, you will begin to sense this presence within you. It is not something that comes and goes. It is always here, always now. It is the awareness that looks through your eyes, that listens through your ears, that experiences the world through your senses. It has no form, no name, no identity, yet it is more real than anything that appears and disappears in time. This presence is the same in all beings, the same consciousness that moves through you, moves through all of existence. It is not personal, it is not bound to a single individual, it is universal. This is why, when you look deeply into another person's eyes, beyond the surface level of personality, beyond thoughts and emotions, you begin to sense something familiar. You are not looking at a separate being, you are looking at the same presence that exists within you. This recognition is the end of division, the end of the illusion of separateness. It is why love, in its purest form, is not about desire or attachment, but about seeing the oneness in another. It is a recognition of the same presence, the same life force, the same divine essence. Most people live their entire lives trapped in the illusion of separateness. They seek fulfillment in external things, in achievements, in relationships, in status, in possessions. But no matter what they attain, something always feels incomplete. This incompleteness is not because they lack something external. It is because they have lost connection with their true nature. They have forgotten what they already are. They are searching for God without realizing that what they seek is already within them, as them. The mind resists this realization because it thrives on distinction, on labels, on boundaries. The ego wants to be something, to define itself as separate, as special, as different. It fears dissolving into something greater because it believes that means losing itself. But in reality, the dissolution of the ego is not a loss. It is a return to wholeness. It is a falling away of the false, so that what has always been true can be seen clearly. When you recognize that God is not something external, not something other than you, there is a profound shift. You no longer seek completion in the future, in some distant goal, in some imagined state of enlightenment. You no longer look to the world to give you what you already are. Instead, you rest in the knowing that you are already whole, already complete, already one with the presence that pervades all things, the trees, the rivers, the stars, the vast sky. All of it is an expression of the same formless presence that exists within you. The idea of an external God dissolves because you see that there has never been anything outside of this presence. It is not something you need to reach. It is something you simply need to recognize, and in that recognition, the illusion of separateness fades. There is no longer you and God. There is only being, only presence, only the infinite stillness that has always been here.